And now to this evening's proceedings. It's a very real pleasure to introduce Professor Margaret Miller. Professor Miller is the Arthur and Rennie George Professor of Classical Archaeology at the University of Sydney, a position she has held since 2005. She was educated at the Universities of British Columbia, Oxford, and Harvard, and received her doctorate from the latter. Before arriving to our great benefit in Sydney, our speaker had taught at McMaster University and the University of Toronto in Canada. Professor Miller holds many academic and research roles, though here I shall only mention that she is a co-director of the Zagora Archaeological Project, and we are very happy to have her as a colleague in this capacity as well. Professor Miller is, of course, an internationally acclaimed scholar on the relations between the Greek world, particularly Athens, and the Achaemenid Empire, and the Athenian perceptions of that empire. Her research and publications have greatly enriched our understanding of this complex, multifaceted relationship, and her 1997 monograph, Athens and Persia in the 5th century BC, a study in cultural receptivity, is a milestone in this area of research. Her many scholarly papers on aspects of this relationship have reinforced her position as the foremost authority in the field. I, for one, eagerly await her forthcoming book, Representation and Misrepresentation, Imaging Persians in Athens. It is on such themes that Professor Miller will present this evening, so I invite her to deliver her lecture, Ancient Greeks on Persians, Wishful Thinking in Imagery. Meg, if you could share your screen, please.
I want, first of all, to thank Stavros and the AAIA for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm very grateful to do so because, in fact, represents some of the results of the work that has come out of my most recent funding, the Australian Research Council's grant of a couple of years ago. The grant made it possible for me to hire especially some research assistants to help me get the images I needed for the publications and organize my thoughts and so on and so forth. And a lot of what you're seeing today are brand new digital images that I have, largely thanks to this hard work of Kate McCallan and others. Now, to start with thoughts from East Greece. Sometime towards the end of the 6th century, one Xenophanes of Colophon composed a poem. In winter, as you lie on a soft couch by the fire, full of good food, munching on nuts and drinking sweet wine, then you must ask questions such as these. Where do you come from? Tell me, what is your age? How old were you when the Mede came? The coming of the Mede refers to the conquest of the Lydian kingdom and then the East Greek states by Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire. The Persians had swept through the lands of West Asia from Iran to Turkey. The Greeks had always traded along the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean and coped with the vicissitudes of political change throughout the region. This was something different, though, owing to the long and close relationship between the Greek and Lydian worlds. It was an event so pivotal to Greek popular memory as to be a point of reference. Hence, how old were you when the Mede came? Cyrus's capture of Sardis brought to an end the Lydian kingdom, whose king, Croesus, is seen here on a funeral pyre. He had set a standard of wealth and opulent lifestyle admired by the Greeks. Note his trailing robes. A special Lydian vessel shape, the Lydion, was probably designed to hold a Lydian unguent called baccharis. The popularity of this scented lotion is attested by the fact that across the Mediterranean, local potters made their own versions. Here you see one by an East Greek potter that was exported in antiquity to Italy. Even in Sparta, potters got into the act. This Lydian was made of Laconian clay. It too was exported to Italy. What is more, the Laconian Lydian is more than twice their size at 24.5 centimeters. So Lydian Baccharis was widely popular. Lydian dress and social fashions were also imitated by the Greeks, as some Athenian red figure vases of the late 6th and early 5th century bear witness. They feature Athenians cavorting. The men are decked out in Lydian dress, the flowing chiton and the mitra on their head, and they're even equipped with parasols. It has even been proposed that this vase and castle shows an Athenian on the right entertaining a Lydian friend, recognizable by the mitra on his head and his fine linen chiton. I hope you can make out the thin, wavy lines, the red lines there, that show how light the fabric is. So Lydian Sardis was famed for its riches as well as for its luxury, and for the purity of their gold coinage, the crescid, named after the city's famous king. American excavations of the gold refinery quarter at Sardis have uncovered how local metallurgical skill refined the gifts of the Pactolus River into pure gold and silver. More recently, the great strength of Sardis's fortification walls has been revealed. They were soundly built of ballistic resistant mud brick on a solid stone base, and they were of impressive height. Yet the Persians had taken Sardis, leaving the helmet of one Lydian defender in the destruction debris. Persian strength combined on land and on sea made them near invincible. The idea of invincibility is something that the Persian great kings, especially Darius, urged. On an inscription at Nakhchi-Rustan, Darius proudly proclaimed his conquests with the words, "The spear of the Persian man has gone far. The Persian man, or the Persian man, has delivered battle far indeed from Persia." The great extent of the Persian domain played an important role in ancient Persian rhetoric. Cyrus advertised his conquests by importing craftsmen from distant lands to build his new palace at Pasargadae. Here is Palace P, construction methods attesting to Ionian and Lydian stonemasons here. Whether the distinctive contrast in color of the stone, that's dark gray and white, is local or imported has been much discussed. Significantly though, after bloody conquest, Cyrus took measures to ensure peace throughout his realm by not changing local laws or insisting on new practice. Somewhat later, Persian imperial rhetoric more visibly stressed the roles of the people of the empire. King Darius broadcast the imperial vision by inscriptions. They stressed the extent and exclusiveness of the empire. Sorry, I meant to say the inclusiveness. They were exclusive compared to other empires, but they were inclusive of those who were within. High on the facade of Darius's tomb, above engaged Persian-style columns, is relief of something that looks like a stool termed a throne. The king stands on it. Here, a text is presented in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. We cannot consider now all its content, but one phrase is especially important. It will already be familiar to you. But here is the context. If now you shall think how many other countries which King Darius held, look at the sculptors who bear the throne, then shall you know, then shall it become known to you, the spear of the Persian man has gone far. Then shall it become known to you, the Persian man has delivered battle far indeed from Persia. That's Amelie Court's translation. Walser's detailed drawing of the figures bearing the throne show them dressed in their distinctive regional garbs. They are identified by inscription. Note the emphasis on breadth of conquest and the visual representation that the king's authority rests on the support of his peoples, literally on their upraised hands. In this company of all the nations, here are the Iana, or Ionian Greeks, and the Lydians, their neighbors. The same message of extensive domain and peaceful collaboration appears in the Apadana at Persepolis, where groups of people, delegations from all over the empire, process, bearing gifts. This section by Aster features 3 peoples, each garbed in their regional dress. They're not just any 3 people. They represent the furthest extent of empire. Far to the east, the Arachosians at the top. Far to the west, the Lydians at the bottom, and roughly in the center, the Babylonians. Note the distinctive dress of the Lydians. It resembles Greek dress, with chiton, cloak, and boots. A mitra distinguishes the Lydian from Greek, as we've seen. A statue of Darius recovered at Susa in Iran in the 1970s uses a different medium to deliver the same message. The statue is Egyptian and made in the Egyptian mode, although with careful attention to present Darius in Persian court dress. On its base, there are cartouches with sketches of the peoples of the empire they list above. You can recognize again the Lydian by their mitra and lack of sleeves. Most of the peoples of the empire, including the Persians, wore sleeved garments and trousers. Clearly, a different dress code from Lydia and Greeks. Now, Bruno Jacobs made this handy map that sets the peoples in the cartouches on that statue in their respective domains. I circle here the Lydians and the Persians. Here are the people from the stairs that we were just looking at. Lydians, Babylonians, and Arachosians. The Persians truly did have a world empire. Now that fact was well known to the Athenians when in 490, Datis and Artaphernes landed at Marathon. Athenian victory at Marathon, partly owing to clever utilization of the varied terrain, was perhaps more symbolic than strategic, but it was a victory all the same. Now, this image of the battle on a marble sarcophagus was made centuries later in Italy. At the time of Marathon, Greek figural imagery was predominantly of mythological, not historical subject matter. Marathon changed that. After Marathon, a flood of depictions of Greek hoplites defeating Persians enters Athenian art, especially after the fuller and even scarier invasion of Xerxes in 480-479, with its final united Greek victory on land at Plataea. Over the following decades, in vase painting, battle gives way to other themes that take the mickey out of the Persians and place them in absurd situations, or try to domesticate them until they actually disappear, being metamorphosed into the creatures who spout wings or battle mythical creatures. What is remarkable is the way in which Persians are differently projected in Attic art from the later 6th to the later 4th centuries, when during the whole period, Persians still controlled the eastern lands. The Persian Empire held extraordinary resources, extraordinary wealth, especially once they had access to Lydian gold and great military strength, bolstered by Phoenician naval power. Inevitably, Persians figured in all Greek economic and political calculations. I propose now to show you some ways in which Athenians coped with this reality through lens of Attic red-figured vase painting. In the Persian Wars period, the imagery is all about battle, especially on drinking cups, but also on wine jugs and other vessels. We get a consistent picture of valiant individual Greek hoplites defeating Persians. Yet, in contrast to what happens later, the invading troops are fully equipped in the manner of their people. And even when succumbing to the Greeks, battle on. The Battle of Marathon had been a glorious victory. Athenians commemorated that victory by showing the Persians as dangerous opponents, armed differently perhaps, and unable to withstand the hoplite phalanx, but an enemy whose defeat gave them great glory. Especially on a cup in Oxford, but elsewhere too, the vase painters carefully delineated the weaponry and the clothing of the different troops that made up the imperial armies. My favorite instance of ethnographic accuracy is the figure over here at the right, holding the Persian Geron shield. The red arrows show where others Gera were held. The Geron shield is leather with inwoven withies, as we have now attested archaeologically, from a shield from Pasargadae and a Parthian shield. The Persian at the right raises high his spear and wears the fish scale corset mentioned by Herodotus. The same shield is held by a Persian on a skyphos in Berlin. Remarkably, a long lost cup, published in 1847 and then disappeared, has surfaced in New York. Although sadly battered, it offers valuable evidence. It shows a Geron viewed sideways. It had been set up, as Herodotus describes, in a shield wall, behind which an archer might safely shoot. This archer, in imminent danger of being speared, bravely continues fighting with his sword, his short sword. You will have noticed that the various Persians here are all differently dressed. Within the common idiom of leggings, sleeves, shoes, and leather hat, their variability of detail is remarkable. I used to think that this was just pot painters having fun with patterns, but after close examination of the disparate evidence, both from Persian arts and modern experiments in sprang technique, I now accord them greater credit. The painters are giving us an insight into the many different regional contingents in the Persian army. It is interesting, for example, to compare the range of hats visible on Attic painting of about 490 to 450. Compare that variety with the variety attested in the Persepolis delegations. In the imagery about the time of the Persian Wars, the Persians are not always losing. On this amphora in Berlin, the Persian is on the attack. His quiver is full, and he still holds his bow in his left hand, hidden from us by his shield. But he now prepares to engage in close combat, battle axe in hand. More typically, however, the Persian is giving ground, even if he valiantly tries to defend himself with sword against the hoplite spear. As we progress throughout the 5th century, from about 460, the imagery moves into a more rhetorical mode that stresses Greek superiority at the cost of the enemy. Persians are on the defensive, yielding ground. But what will have caught your eye is that the hoplite is naked, barring greaves and helmet. He has been, in some sense, elevated into heroic status. Moreover, the ability of the Persian to defend himself is compromised by his strategic weakness. Note the empty quivers, and indeed, the arrow that flies uselessly past the hoplite on the Chicago painter Oinakawe. In the middle third of the 5th century, as you can see here, Persian spears, a primary weapon used in life, disappear from Attic painting. The emphasis in art now is on archery, deemed by Greeks, to be the weapon of the coward. Now, showing the dismay of the Persian offers a third strategy for presenting the superiority of the hoplite. The arresting frontal face on the basal crater shows the Persian's terror as he rushes off to the right. He knows the inadequacy of his short sword against the hoplite spear. Note his empty quiver. A late mug in the shape of a Persian's head offers a rare facial expression. Now, usually in ancient Greek arts, stance and gesture alone convey mood and emotion. But this Persian's knotted brows, wrinkled forehead, and parted lips show his dismay. Alexander Willig in the British Museum has suggested that this Persian exhibits such consternation owing to his terror at coming face to face with a Greek drinker. In the last third of the 5th century, very few battles against Persians are depicted, but those that survive show an exaggeration of all these features. This jug in Hamburg shows a battling Greek against Persians. He wears only a helmet, not even greaves. He is surrounded by his Persian enemy, who actually wield spears as they ought. But note, nonetheless, they all flee at the fury of his assault. Only the archer at far left continues to fight. The most outrageous attack on a Persian is to be seen on the notorious oinokoe of the 460s in Hamburg. It parodies Greeks' victorious advance on the Persian foe. A naked Greek rushes to the right towards his opponent, arm outstretched, but not bearing a shield. No helmet, no greaves, no baldric are visible, only a rough square cloak knotted at the throat, the poor man's tree bone. Frames his naked body. He grasps his weapon in his right hand, ready to thrust at his opponent. A Persian on the other side of the vase, not simultaneously visible with the Greek. In fact, as Frank Wildebrandt has pointed out, the two figures are carefully set off-center on each side, both pushed back towards the handle to maximize their separation. The Persian is minimally equipped. His tiara lappets hang loose, and a one-piece jumpsuit covers his body. A curious inner line follows all the contours of the garment as if trying to stress the naked body beneath the patterned dress. His bow is uselessly strapped to his quiver, and his baldric slips off his shoulder, emphasizing his inability to fight back. Hands are raised to his head in a gesture that is not precisely paralleled, but combines with his frontal face to suggest strong emotion. What is for some the most exciting aspect of the Hamburg oinokoe has also been the most difficult. An inscription in added white winds its way from in front of the Greek's mouth downwards and outwards into the surface of the pot, to cross over into the space between the Persian's legs, as if ensnaring him. Commencement by the Greek's mouth should make all of it the Greek's utterance, as Georg Gerlachner has now attested. He restores a final sigma, making the inscription end in a second person verb, and so declaring, "I am Eurymedon, you stand bent over." The question whether the name Eurymedon can or should refer to the double land and sea victory against the Persians under the Athenian general Cimon about 468, as initially proposed by Schellenberg, has been contested. Yet, the reading, despite the lack of parallel for such a historical allusion in Attic art, makes the most sense. It is difficult to believe that in the period in which this oinokoe was produced, with such an image, the name Eurymedon could refer to anything other than the battle. This is especially in view of the off-characterization of the Greek, with his straggly beard and knotted thin cloak. Dover's early translation, "We buggered the Greek Persians at Eurymedon," surely still holds. Now, Greek victory at Eurymedon, that was a double land and sea victory at the edges of the Persian Empire, perhaps halted Persian military aggression towards the Greeks outside their empire, but it did not damage the empire itself. Persian strategy thereafter was to maintain diplomatic relations and to play the Greek states one off another, by investing their wealth and working through intermediaries. In response, Athenian arts extracted Persians from the battlefield and put them into 3 Greek-style genre scenes of everyday life. The warrior's departure, the symposium, and visits to the tomb. In the warrior's departure, a warrior pouring a libation with a woman is characterized not as a hoplite here, but as a Persian. Sometimes in the imagery of warriors' departures, foreign vessels are used, like this drinking horn. The symposium, sometimes Persians recline on cleani, as if taking part in a Greek-style symposium. Although they do use Persian metalware vessels, offset rim on a bowl, an animal head cup, and drinking horns. Sometimes in a tomb scene on a white ground lekathos, showing a woman making offerings to the deceased. The man accompanying is a Persian rather than a hoplite, possibly meant to be himself the deceased. On this lekathos in Tübingen, both wear Persian dress, and here the vessel, again at use, is a drinking horn. Now, the English historian David Cannadine, in tracing the history of the British Empire, argued, pace Edward Said and his Orientalist followers, the British Empire was not exclusively concerned with the creation of otherness on the presumption that the imperial periphery was different from and inferior to the imperial metropolis. It was rather concerned with what has been recently called the construction of affinities. The British Empire was about the familiar and the domestic, as well as the different and the exotic. It was indeed, in large part, about the domestication of the exotic, the comprehending and the reordering of the foreign in parallel, analogous, equivalent, resemblant terms. Such a process of domestication is what we see in Attic vase painting. Whether we look at libations of departing warriors, symposia, or visits to the tomb, we see a deliberate creation of the concept of the home life of the Persian as resembling that of the Greeks. By these means, the Persian would seem to have been tamed, rendered familiar as a psychological tactic to help cope with the strangeness of Persian foreignness and real power. The stress of the foreignness and the real power. Now, within the Persian Empire, display of authority through orchestrated public events supported the magnificence of the king. These, of course, do not survive. They were actions. Images of the kings enthroned, at larger scale than those around him, occur at a number of places. But the fact that processions played an important role is brought out by classical literary sources and corroborated by the series of reliefs on 2 sides of Persepolis' Apadana, which show delegations from all over the empire. These 2 preserve record of the practice. This detail again shows the Lydians, and here are the Iona, or Ionians. So in addition to the presentation of Persians in Greek genre scenes, about a quarter of the images of Persians relate to Persian power imagery. Such scenes are throne scenes, hunting, riding. Each in some way relates to a Persian activity of highly symbolic significance. The royal audience, hunting against bears, boar, stag, you name it, as well as battle and riding. Which is in battle as well as on the hunt. The Attic images show knowledge of Persian practice. Court performative display helped shape the Greek mental image of Persianness. Yet in the Greek rendering, Persian practice is often perverted, sometimes humorously. A handful of scenes within an enthroned Persian date to the third quarter of the 5th century. On this lekythos in Paris, the bearded man is sitting on a klismos, the chair usually seen in interior scenes with Athenian ladies, not a throne. Hunting imagery also appears, but not always gloriously. A lion hunt gone wrong figures on the Soinakwe in Paris. Here, in the face of a lion attack on his horse, all the Persian hunter can do in this moment of terrible peril is panic and wildly gesticulate. The Greeks were well aware of Persian riding skills, but mounted Persians on horses rarely appear in 5th century art. When they do appear, mounted Persians appear, they're figures of ridicule. Their mounts are peasant donkeys or bizarre-looking camels rather than noble horses. Here, the painter mockingly presents a Persian warrior riding side saddle with a footrest on an intransigent donkey. The beast stands still, refusing to budge. Note the ears, lying back, evidence of donkey bad temper, and the arc of its tail, suggesting it may need to attend to nature. The knight is stuck. He needs his attendant to run up, flail in hand, to assist his progression. Now, as for camels, it is not clear to what extent camels were used in Persian imperial armies, or more generally. The limited evidence for the mode of camel riding suggests that, as on these ceilings from Daskyleon on the left, men rode Bactrian camels astride. Arabian camel riders evidently rode with their feet forward of the hump on some form of padding. In stark contrast, the 3 Persian camel riders in Attic 5th century vase painting ride their camels side saddle. The most majestic camel rider appears on the squat lekythos in London at the end of the 5th century. The focal point of a major procession, he is surrounded by emblems of authority. Procession rhetoric played an important role in communication in pre-modern societies, but it's hard for us to document the mechanisms used or the response on the part of the witnessing population. Can we read the London lekythos as reflecting real Persian procession rhetoric or practice? The camel itself is depicted with unusual naturalism. It's hard to make out. I hope the drawing will help, but it has 2 toes carefully delineated. And in front of the camel, a man on foot conducts it by means of a rope that rises to the camel's nose. And above, you can see something that may be meant to be the genuine Bactrian camel nose peg. The dignitary himself rides on a credible Persian-style rectilinear riding cloth with decorative border. But what of the accompanying throng? Achaemenid royal processions are described in classical texts, as I mentioned, notably the description of Curtius on the campaign trail of Darius III. Some consistency of detail between the different texts inspires confidence that the basic principles of genuine procession practice in the Achaemenid Empire can be retrieved, and we might even see it reflected in the imagery at Persepolis. These principles include the king travels at the center, not at the front, not at the back, at the center, in a chariot. Okay, at less public moments, he may choose to ride in another mode. Our figure is at the center, and he does ride a camel. He extends his right arm in a commanding gesture, but it's not really intelligible to us. Secondly, the king is surrounded by symbols of his standing. Our camel rider is attended by figures bearing symbols of rank, a fan bearer just in front, and behind, in the position of a fly-whisk bearer, walks a figure holding something aloft with 2 hands. Now, this actually is a bit tricky. It has gilding on the things that look like flames above it. Its identity has been much discussed. It has been suggested to be a barsoom, but we really don't know. But clearly, it's something significant or meant to be significant. And finally, the king is accompanied by followers whose relative rank in the entourage is manifested by dress, equipment, and action. On the Onokoe, outside of the core of rods bearer, camel rider with guide and fan bearer, 6 other figures do attend, 4 musicians and 2 dancers. There is some effort to emphasize the Persian content. The male participants wear credible riding dress. Their dance is surely the Persian oklasma. Yet we are well away from real Persian processions. 2 tympanum-bearing women number among the attendants. Most of the males in the scene are beardless and perhaps are intended to be eunuchs. The only bearded attendants are on the fringes. No royal guards these, they are dancing the sinuous oklasma. So within the overall structure of the historic Persian royal procession, the details of the scene have been manipulated in such a way as to stress effete luxury rather than prestigious opulence, indulgence rather than authority. It is a total construct, perhaps thrusting later 5th century Orientalist notions about Persian monarchs into the known subject of the royal progress. Its centerpiece is a quintessentially foreign beast that possibly was never worn by a real great king. An ambiguous, if small, late 5th century crater in Vienna presents a court scene. The dignitary at the center, on the throne with a footstool, is attended by guards and a fan bearer. He is being entertained by music and oklasma dancing. On the vase itself, traces of gilding on the added white suggest that the extravagant scene was originally richly decorated. Like the London Onokoe, the vision here has little to do with the formality and ordered ranking, coded ranking of the real Persian court. So some Athenian painters presenting elements of the authority imagery blur the boundaries. On this round head cup in St. Petersburg of about 430, a Persian strikes a heroic stance to defend his horse from the ravages, not of a lion, as one might expect, but of a griffin. The appearance of griffin as quarry foreshadows the most fascinating aspect of the Persian Attic imagery, their assimilation within griffin fighting Aramas in the 4th century. The closest link between the two is on the Xenophantus Lekythos of the early 4th century. Here, in a convincingly Persian-style hunt with all the accoutrements of a real hunt, complete with a chariot and mounted hunters, personages are labeled with real Persian names. They include the names Darius and Cyrus, and they hunt prey like boar and stag. But amidst the quarry appear winged griffins. With images such as these in the later classical Attic art, Persians are literally mythicized out of existence. They're made creatures of fantasy. And so that takes us to the problem with Persians. One of the really puzzling aspects related to Persians in Attic imagery is they basically disappear. The evidence is scattered, but it can be tracked with one intriguing body of material: figure vases. The reduction of battle imagery over the 5th century is not surprising in view of the change of world circumstances, but Persian warriors are replaced by oklasma dancers in the form of figured perfume bottles. In some cases, Persians grow wings, perhaps part of the mythicization of Persians we've seen. I show you here one in Berlin and one in London. Persians seem to merge into griffin fighting Aramas, but whether this is to flag their wide domain, because Aramas do live far to the east, or to remove them from the here and now, is not clear. The conflation of historical Persians with the mythical occupants of the east also appears in a new mode that emerged about the 480s. The suggestive collocation of protomes within one frame, notably on Pelikai. Larger vessels we have 3 protones, a human flanked by a horse and an eagle griffin. The human Persians wear some form of tiara and are positioned at center. All three usually face the same direction, but sometimes two of the protomes face the third, like the one in Madrid. Usually the human is not bearded, raising the question of gender, although some certainly have added white skin. These could be Amazons or Aramasps. No wonder what the specifics. In this form of visual synecdoche, as Ian McPhee has aptly termed it, it is up to the reader, the viewer, to read whether mounted griffin combat or something else is intended. But Ian McPhee has actually found 3 on which the figures have beards. They include one from the Dardanelles, now lost but attested by photograph, one excavated at Phalasarna in Crete, now in the Chania Museum, one in Manchester, not yet published, but Jamila Briggs very kindly sent me this image. And I have to say, I owe a great debt of gratitude to Ian McPhee for all his help in the 4th century imagery. So this collocation of human heads, male and female, with griffin protomes, moves us into the realm of creative imagination. Elsewhere, we find people riding griffins or fighting griffins, but there's no doubt that the fantastic griffin is part of their world. Where is that world? Would viewers see these as Persians? Or is the question, in fact, irrelevant in the 4th century? For all that there is an emphasis on military themes and Greek victory, and for all that over the 5th century, the contrast with Persians proved essential to find Greek identity, the Persians are not demonized in Greek art, as has been pointed out, especially by Eric Gruen. Instead, we find a sometimes well-informed fascination about and even admiration for Persian life, dress, and manners, as we've been observing on the accurate depiction of the Geron shield, such as here. Nevertheless, as time goes on, there is a readiness to present Persian actions and social practice in a somewhat discreditable light. In the case of the Berlin Skiffos, it has been observed that the man with the shield is starting up rather than just resting on the rock. Perhaps in response to the report of the man running in on the other side, which has been interpreted to signal an all is lost, sauve qui peut message. I suppose the message we are meant to see is these Persians are responding to the threat of the arrival of some Greeks. Pages quickly latched onto this facet's military life that most contrasted with Greek ideals of martial valor, and soon avoided what most characterized the Persians and made them a dangerous enemy. The view of Persians riding side saddle on donkeys and camels may be a reflective debunking of a continuing Persian supremacy, real supremacy in life, in cavalry. The interest in non-military subject matters, the domestication of the exotic, as Canadine put it, worked to make the Persians more manageable by being reordered, in his words, in parallel, analogous, equivalent, resemblant terms. And then they were turned into distant griffin fighters in what I've called the problem with Persians. I chose these two especially because they clearly have a beard as well as clearly wearing Persian clothing. Now, in the later 5th and 4th century, when the Persians were being alternatively ridiculed or mythicized in most of Attic red figure, the reality of the strength of the Persian Empire must be recalled. It was a world in which the great king pulled the strings. The famous name vase of the Apulian Darius painter is not technically within my study, but it does show well awareness of the complexity of Persian imperial and social and economic structures. It is wise to remember the terms of the king's peace of 367 BC, where we are told, King Artaxerxes thinks it just that the cities in Asia should belong to him, as well as Klazomenai and Cyprus among the islands, and that the other Greek islands, both small and great, should be left independent, except Lemnos, Imbros, and Skyros, and these should belong as of old to the Athenians. But whichever of the two parties does not accept this peace, upon them I will make war in company with those who desire this arrangement, both by land and by sea, with ships and with money. You need to remember, the great king was still very powerful and capable of dictating terms. It is often said by scholars studying the collapse of the Persian Empire at the assaults of Alexander the Great, that it was because the Persians were weak. Not so, not so. Alexander had the luck to have a very well-trained army by his father, Philip of Macedon. He also was, in fact, a strategic genius. So the question we have to ask is, was the reality of life with the Persians in the 4th century just a bit too grim? Is this why Persians start to behave like Greek symposiasts or take up hunting exotic mythical creatures? Or, as we increasingly see, they become amorous. They woo ladies. Sometimes they even ride tame camels in pursuit of amorous adventure. Now, we do have some battles against Persians in the 4th century that show extraordinary accuracy in the depiction of Greek hoplite and light-armed Psiloi tackling mounted Persians. These images are hard to interpret. One possibility is they may hark back to the Marathonomachy of the Stoipoikile. It is exciting to find new representations to add to the corpus. 2 have recently emerged. I'm grateful to Cyrus Palace for drawing my attention to a fragmentary pellicy from Pella, where 2 Greeks with Boeotian helmet and shield tackle a mounted Persian. The added white of the horse must have especially drawn the eye when it was intact. Over at the Hermitage, our colleagues, especially Anna Petrakova, have been studying the forgotten ceramics discovered in the Crimea in the 19th century. They include another battle pellicy, again of the 4th century, fragmentary but restorable. Again, a 3-figure composition. This one is remarkable for the tiara worn by the Persian. The distinctive bump at the front is so akin to that of Persepolis Delegation 17 as to make it clear that this figure is not Persian at all. He is one of the Sogdian contingent in the Imperial army. So here's a map to help you remember where Sogdiana is, far off to the east and north. So even in the midst of a mode to ease the Persian military strength from Attic consciousnesses, acute awareness of it in all its variety of detail is to be seen. It is clear that we can hope for new discoveries to enrich our understanding of ancient Athenian projections of Persians. We have seen a range from respect coupled with ethnographic accuracy to poking fun at Persians, aspects of Persian military strength, to a sort of elimination of what we might call the Persia problem by throwing them out of Central Asia, where dangerous griffins lived. While there's a fair bit of accurate observation, we can also see traces of strategic, psychological reassurance projecting what people wished were true.